She had been on his plane for 40 minutes before she found out it was his plane. Victoria Hale was the kind of woman who made decisions about people in the first 10 seconds and spent the rest of her time being consistent with those decisions. It had served her well. 30 years of boardrooms, acquisitions, hostile negotiations, and the particular intellectual warfare of a competitive industry had honed her instinct into something she trusted completely. She ran a $9 billion industrial manufacturing company. She had appeared on the covers of 3 national business magazines. She had been in rooms where she was simultaneously the youngest person, the only woman, and the most competent person present, and she had learned to announce her authority not through volume, but through the specific quality of presence that says, "I have already assessed this situation, and here is what comes next." She was wrong today. She had looked at the man in seat 7A and been wrong in a way that was going to play out at 35,000 feet with no exit, in front of the 8 other passengers in the main cabin, and at the hands of a captain who was about to walk out of the cockpit holding a tablet and ask a question that would rewrite every assumption she had made in the last 40 minutes. The man in seat 7A owned this aircraft. He owned the airline. He had been sitting there for the entire flight, reading his maintenance agreement and drinking his coffee. And he had not said a single word about any of it, because he did not need to. Because he was the kind of man who understood, at a very deep level, that authority is not announced. It is demonstrated when the moment calls for demonstration, and otherwise it simply exists. Leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from, because what happens on this flight is going to stay with you. Malik Reed had been 44 years old for 3 months, and he wore it the way certain men wear their age, not as erosion but as accumulation. The years visible in the steadiness of his posture, and the particular quality of patience he brought to rooms that required patience, and the particular quality of directness he brought to rooms that required directness. He was 6'1" with the physical alignment of a man who had spent 11 years in the United States Air Force doing work that required his body to be trusted entirely, and the bearing of a man who had learned through those 11 years that confidence was not a performance. It was a condition. Either you had it or you didn't, and the having of it had nothing to do with who else was in the room. He had grown up in Baltimore, in a neighborhood called Waverly that had its own particular character, block associations, front stoops used as community meeting places, the specific texture of a working-class neighborhood that had produced its share of people who went on to do exceptional things, and who tended, those people, to understand that the neighborhood had been the first teacher and to treat it accordingly. His father Raymond had driven the same Ford for 19 years, maintained it himself down to the last bolt, and had told Malik on the occasion of the car's 15th birthday that replacing a working thing before it was done working was a form of ingratitude that he did not practice and did not intend to begin. His mother Gloria had run the administrative operations of a regional hospital for 26 years, managing budgets and staffing and vendor relationships, and the particular human complexity of a healthcare institution with the organized mind of someone who could hold 17 variables simultaneously and never lose track of any of them. Malik had inherited something from each of them. From Raymond, the philosophy that a thing worth doing was worth doing completely, which manifested in him as an almost physical intolerance for cutting corners, the kind of intolerance that had made him an exceptional maintenance technician at 16 working summers at a small airfield outside Baltimore, the kind that had pushed him through 4 years at the Air Force Academy when the easier path was always visible and always rejected. From Gloria, the ability to map complex systems in his head and identify the failure points before they became failures, a gift that had served him first in cockpits and later in boardrooms, and later still in the particular complexity of running a company, which is a system made of human beings, the most unpredictable of all components. He had gone to the Air Force Academy on an appointment that required 3 sustained years of effort to secure, grades that needed to be exceptional, letters of recommendation that needed to be more than perfunctory, a physical fitness standard he trained toward for the better part of a year, and a nomination process that required him to explain, clearly and convincingly, why he specifically deserved one of the limited available slots. He had explained it in writing, had flown to the congressman's district for an interview, had sat across from an interviewer who asked him about his motivation in ways designed to find the answer underneath the prepared answer, and had given the answer underneath, that he had been watching aircraft from the Baltimore airfield since he was 14, that the relationship between precision and consequence in a cockpit was unlike anything he had encountered elsewhere, and that he intended to spend a significant portion of his life operating within it. He got the slot. He graduated 4 years later in the top 10% of his class, having excelled in the disciplines that interested him: aeronautical engineering, instrument navigation, systems integration, and performed competently in the disciplines that did not. He earned his pilot's wings in the year following graduation and spent the next decade flying. He logged over 8,000 hours across multiple aircraft types: trainers, fighters, transport aircraft, and eventually the specific discipline of instrument flying in conditions that removed all visual reference and required you to trust the instruments and your training and your own judgment, and nothing else, at speeds and altitudes where the margin between a correct decision and a catastrophic one was measured in seconds and fractions of seconds. He deployed twice and was decorated twice and developed, over 11 years in the Air Force, a relationship with risk that was neither fear nor recklessness, but something more useful than either: a precise calibration of what the actual danger was, distinct from the perceived danger, and a trained ability to act on the actual rather than the perceived. He left the Air Force at 35, not because the Air Force pushed him out, but because he could see what he wanted to build, and had been thinking about it for 3 years, and the building required his full attention. Reed Horizon Aviation had started with 2 planes, a leased hangar at a regional airport in Maryland, and Malik himself in 3 simultaneous roles: pilot, salesman, and on the days the maintenance contractor was unavailable, mechanic. He had no investors. He had savings from 11 years of military service, a small inheritance from his grandfather, and the specific confidence of someone who has done extremely difficult things and understands that building a small company, while genuinely hard, is not the hardest thing they have ever done. He attracted his first institutional client in the 6th month by doing something no competitor had done. He sat down with the client's travel coordinator and asked her to describe in exhaustive detail every failure and frustration she had experienced with every aviation vendor she had used in the previous 3 years. He listened for 90 minutes without interruption. He did not begin formulating his sales pitch while she was speaking. He listened because what she was telling him was a precise specification of what the product needed to be, which was more valuable than any market research he could have conducted independently. When she finished, he told her specifically which of those failures he could prevent, and how, which ones required broader systemic changes beyond what he could currently offer, and what he would do if a problem arose anyway. He offered a 6-month trial with no penalty for exit. She signed. They had been clients for 8 years. The growth after that had been steady and deliberate. Year 1, a second plane, the first full-time pilot who was not Malik, a part-time dispatcher who later became his director of operations. Year 2, a maintenance operations staffed internally, because Malik had determined early that maintenance outsourced was maintenance he could not guarantee, and he was not willing to carry that uncertainty. A preferential gate agreement at a regional airport that gave his clients shorter transit times and better service. Year 3, the first wide-body conversion, which opened corporate route service between East Coast cities. Year 5, the first profitable year, which his CFO considered a milestone, and which Malik considered the beginning of the real work, because staying profitable required a different discipline than reaching it. Year 8, 31 aircraft in service, 2 FAA commendations for safety protocol innovation, an uninterrupted safety record across more than 12,000 combined flight hours, and a culture in the organization that was the direct output of what Malik had decided the company was going to be at the moment he signed the first client. Everyone on a Reed Horizon aircraft is treated with courtesy. Everyone, without exception. Not as a policy, as a fact of the company. He had a daughter named Zoe. She was 9 years old, and she was, since her mother's death 4 years ago, the person around whom everything else was organized. Not in the suffocating way of a man who has made a child carry the weight of his grief, but in the practical, intentional way of a man who has looked at his situation clearly and determined that her welfare is the first thing that everything else must be arranged around, and who has done the arranging accordingly. Denise had been his wife for 7 years. She had been, in those 7 years, the person who understood him most precisely, who knew the difference between the silences that meant he was processing something and the silences that meant he needed to be interrupted, who could read the residue of a difficult day on his face before he had said a word, who had loved him with the specific intelligence of someone who had taken the time to know who he actually was and built her love from that knowledge rather than from the idea of him. She died from an illness that arrived without warning, an aggressive diagnosis delivered on a Tuesday afternoon that became 14 months of fighting. 14 months during which Malik had been present and functional and had not allowed himself the luxury of collapse, because collapse was not available to him at a cost he could afford to pay. He had grieved in the specific ongoing way of someone who has lost the person who knew them best and who carries that loss not as an event but as a permanent alteration of the internal landscape. He had raised Zoe through the 4 years since. She was 9 now, and she was sharp and composed, and had her mother's gift of reading faces and her father's gift of waiting for the full picture before she drew a conclusion, and some third thing that was entirely her own. Quality of watchful precision that manifested as the color-coded paper calendar she kept on her desk, which tracked her schedule and her father's schedule, and the things she considered important enough to monitor. She had started the calendar at 7, without being taught to, after observing that information existed in her father's schedule, that affected her schedule, and that the current system for communicating this information was inadequate. She had made a better system. Malik had observed this and decided it was a management skill and had not interfered with it. He missed her when he traveled. He traveled as infrequently as he could justify. This trip was necessary. A maintenance partnership agreement with a European aviation services company had reached its final stage, and it was significant enough, in financial terms, in strategic terms, in what it meant for the company's long-term maintenance standards and fleet management capability, that Malik had decided to be present for the final review rather than delegate. He was flying on his own corporate shuttle, a converted Gulfstream operating on the Maryland to Chicago route, 3 days a week for executive travel. He had chosen seat 7 because the forward cabin was configured for group work, and he needed 4 hours of uninterrupted reading. He had his notebook, his coffee, the agreement on his tablet. He had allocated the time and intended to use it. Victoria Hale boarded 14 minutes before departure. She came down the aisle in the specific way of someone who considers the space between themselves and their destination an obstacle to be traversed efficiently. She was in her late 50s, dressed with the deliberate precision of someone for whom appearance is managed communication. Dark, tailored blazer, fitted trousers, hair arranged with the kind of effort that presents itself as effortless because it costs enough to look that way. An assistant trailed behind her, managing a phone call and a rolling bag simultaneously with the practiced competence of someone who has adapted to this life fully and no longer notices its demands. Victoria Hale had the composure of a person who was accustomed to arriving places and having those places adjust themselves to accommodate her arrival, which they generally did, because she was Victoria Hale. And that was how it generally worked. She stopped at Malik's row, looked at the overhead bin above her seat where his bag occupied one side. "Move your bag," she said. It was not phrased as a request. It was phrased as the communication of a preference to a person whose function is to accommodate it. Malik looked up from his notebook. He looked at the bin above her seat. He looked at the bin across the aisle, which had his bag's equivalent space available on the right side. He looked back at her and held her gaze with the easy, undefensive patience of a man who has been looked at as a logistical inconvenience for most of his adult life and has long since stopped treating it as an emergency. He stood, moved his bag to the right side of the bin across the aisle, creating the space she wanted directly above hers, and sat back down and opened his notebook. "There you go," he said. She did not respond to this. She settled into her seat with the composure of someone receiving what they expected to receive. The assistant stowed Victoria's bag, confirmed a meeting time for the following morning in the specific practiced shorthand of a person who has confirmed meeting times in this way several hundred times, and departed. Victoria took out her phone, and the first call began before the aircraft finished taxiing. It was a call about a contract. She mentioned figures, names in the rapid shorthand of someone who speaks this language daily and assumes that the other person on the line speaks it too. The call had the character of a decision being relayed rather than a conversation being had. She had already decided the call was notification. It ended. A second began within 90 seconds. The second was shorter, the same transactional quality, a direction being given to someone who received it and hung up. She made the calls at a volume that treated the cabin as a private office. Malik noted this in the way he noted things he was not acting on, with the precision of someone building an accurate picture. Between the second and third calls, she reclined her seat without checking whether anyone sat behind her. There was no one immediately behind her. The cabin had 8 passengers spread across its length, but she didn't check, It's because checking would have required a prior acknowledgement that the action had implications for other people, and the action didn't occur to her in those terms. It was simply what happened when she pressed the button. The flight attendant came through the cabin during the interval between calls. Victoria was reviewing something on her phone and did not look up when the attendant passed. The third call was longer. It involved someone she found inadequate. The call lasted 11 minutes, and over those 11 minutes she delivered, in language that was technically professional, a sustained communication of her assessment of that person's performance, the assessment being that the performance was poor and that she expected immediate improvement. She did not raise her voice. The chill of it, Malik thought, was considerably more effective than volume would have been. When the call ended, the phone went into her bag. She looked around the cabin with the survey of someone assessing available resources. "Excuse me," her voice directed at him. He looked up from the agreement. He had been in Section 4 of it, examining the liability cap with care. "Is that coffee?" she said. "Yes. Where did you get it?" "I asked for it when I boarded." She looked toward the galley with the expression of someone adding a data point to a set. "I've been on this aircraft for 30 minutes, she said, "and no one has offered me anything." "The attendant came through twice," Malik said, "both times while you were on calls." The look she gave him lasted 2 seconds and contained, without announcing itself, the full structure of what she thought about his observation. She raised her hand. The gesture was the gesture of someone who expects immediate response, which it received. The flight attendant was at her O in under 30 seconds because this was a Reed Horizon flight and that was the standard, and the standard was real. "Coffee," Victoria said. "Black, and sparkling water." "I'm sorry. We don't carry sparkling water on this route," the flight attendant said pleasantly. "I can offer still water or orange juice." Victoria Hale looked at the flight attendant with the expression of someone receiving information that confirms a prior hypothesis. "Still water," she said. "Of course." The attendant went back to the galley. Victoria turned to the window. A brief pause. Then, in the half-directed tone of someone composing a text message or a private thought that has become briefly audible, "Unbelievable." Malik did not look up. Several minutes passed. She began typing something on her phone. Then, in the same half-directed, semi-ambient way, as if she were narrating to someone who could hear her and who would share her orientation. "The service on these smaller charter operations, you know. You get what you pay for." Typing. Then, after a beat, "The passengers are a mixed bag. Nobody impressive." He heard what was not said. He had been hearing what was not said his entire life. In cockpits and boardrooms and airport lounges, and apparently on his own aircraft at 35,000 feet. He had developed, through years of practice, a policy regarding what was not said. He noted it, filed it, and continued with what he was doing. The noting was not passive. It was the precise, active acknowledgement of something real, held without being acted on. He was not going to allow what was not said to determine his next move, because that would be giving it power he was not interested in granting. He had a Section 4 liability cap to understand fully, and he intended to understand it. He was 2 pages from the end of the agreement when Captain Davis came out of the cockpit. Davis had been with Reed Horizon for 14 years. He was a compact, even-tempered man of 51 who had logged over 20,000 hours, and who had, across 14 years and hundreds of flights, developed the specific quality of effortless authority that long experience in a cockpit produces in pilots who were serious about the work from the beginning. He walked back through the main cabin with his tablet in hand and the mild, professional ease of someone completing a routine administrative task. He stopped at Malik's row. "Mr. Reed," he said, "sorry to interrupt. Operations needs your signature on the fuel surcharge amendment before we land. End of business deadline today." Malik took the tablet. He read the amendment. He read everything before he signed it. A habit from the Air Force that had produced no exceptions in 22 years, and signed it and handed it back. "Thank you, Davis," he said. "Good flight." "Thank you, sir." Davis returned to the cockpit with the ease of a man completing a task he has done many times. The cabin was quiet. It was the specific quiet of a space in which the social composition has just been revised by a fact, and everyone present is engaged in the rapid, private work of processing the revision. The 2 passengers near the back had not looked up from their screens, but their quality of attention had changed. The flight attendant in the galley doorway had the careful, particular neutrality of someone who is aware of something significant and has decided that awareness is sufficient. Victoria Hale was looking at Malik Reed. He recognized the expression. He had seen it in various forms across his professional life. The expression of someone whose model of a situation has been revised by a fact they did not anticipate. who was engaged in the uncomfortable work of recalculating everything they said and did and implied in the period before the revision. The mathematics of it were visible on her face. She was running the last 40 minutes backward, reprocessing each most against this new fact, and the output of the calculation was not comfortable. He let her have the moment. He returned to the last 2 pages of the agreement. "Mr. Reed," she said. He looked up. She had organized her composure fully. What she said next, she said with the deliberate precision of a person who has decided that the right thing to do costs something and who is going to pay the cost directly. "Did the captain address you as the owner of this airline?" "The company," he said. "Reed Horizon Aviation." "Yes." She held his gaze and did the last of the recalculation. He could see, with the precision of a man who has been reading rooms his entire professional life, exactly what was happening. First, assessment, what had occurred, who had witnessed it, what the business implications were. Then, something that followed the assessment, something quieter and more honest than assessment. She was, he thought, a person capable of arriving at honesty. It just sometimes took her a moment. "I didn't realize," she said. "True, not an apology yet." "True, no," Malik said pleasantly. "You didn't." He went back to the agreement, a pause, the kind of pause that has content. That is not the absence of something, but the presence of something being organized. "I'm Victoria Hale," she said. "CEO of Hale Meridian." He knew the company. Industrial manufacturing and supply chain logistics, $9 billion in annual revenue, publicly traded, headquartered in Chicago. He knew it because 3 weeks ago his director of business development had flagged a warm lead with Hale Meridian's procurement division for an executive travel contract. A lead that had stalled at some intermediate level in their organization, without clear explanation. He knew Victoria Hale's name because his director had identified her as the person who ultimately approved major vendor decisions, and had noted that her approval required getting past 3 layers of process that she had designed to keep vendors away from her time. "I know who you are," Malik said. She absorbed this. Then, with the particular timing of a person who has decided to be more direct than the situation requires. "Your team has been in contact with our procurement office, the aviation services contract. I'm aware of it." A pause weighted differently from the previous ones. This one had in it the quality of a person preparing to do something that costs something and not backing away from the cost. She said, "Mr. Reed, I would like to be direct with you." He closed his notebook. He put his pen down. He turned and gave for his complete attention, the specific complete attention of a man accustomed to giving his complete attention to things that matter. "I behaved badly on this flight," she said. "I want to say that plainly, without the qualifications that would dilute it. I was dismissive of the service, and I communicated, in ways that were not subtle, a dismissiveness about the other people on this aircraft. That was wrong, and I want to acknowledge it directly." She said it the way professionals say things they have decided to say, not with theatrical humility, but with the clean delivery of someone who has committed to honesty and is executing that commitment. Malik looked at her for a moment. He thought about Zoe. He thought about the question she had asked at the kitchen table when she was 8 years old, her face carrying the expression she wore when she'd been working through something for days. What do you do when someone is unkind to you and then needs something from you? He had thought before answering. He had said, "I think about what the right thing is." She had asked, "How you know?" He had said, "You think about what you would want done if you were in both positions at once." She had sat with this, the way she sat with things she was deciding were true, and then she had nodded. He thought about what was right, from both positions at once. "I appreciate you saying it," he said. He meant it completely. The acknowledgement was honest, delivered directly and without prompting. That was worth receiving. That was worth responding to with equivalent directness. "Reed Horizon is positioned to serve Hale Meridian's executive travel needs effectively," he said. "The fleet size is appropriate for your scale of operations. The routes we fly cover the cities your executive team travels most frequently. We reviewed that when the lead came in. The safety record is clean across 8 years and over 12,000 combined flight hours, verifiable through the FAA records that are public." He paused a moment. "We are also selective about the clients we work with, and we operate by one standard across the entire company. Every person on a Reed Horizon aircraft is treated with the same courtesy. Crew, passengers, ground staff. The standard applies uniformly without adjustment for the business context or the seniority of who is traveling. This is not a flexible policy. It is how the company functions." Victoria Hale looked at him with the concentrated attention of someone distinguishing between a lecture and a term of business. He watched the moment she determined it was a term of business. "Understood," she said. Good. Have your procurement team send the full requirements document to my Director of Business Development. I'll have a senior person assigned within 2 business days. We'll approach this as a partnership evaluation, not a vendor-client sale. There is a meaningful difference in how we conduct those and in what they produce for both parties. I understand the difference, she said. He believed her. Then we're in a good place to start, Malik said. He picked up his pen. He went back to the agreement. There was one more paragraph in Section 7 that he needed to read before landing. Captain Davis brought the aircraft down 40 minutes later, with the quality that 14 years of caring about the landing as a craft produces, the kind of landing that passengers notice as a landing rather than as an event. They taxied to the private terminal. Malik was the last off the aircraft, finishing a note in his notebook before standing, the way he finished what he was doing before moving to the next thing. At the jetway door, Victoria Hale was waiting for her assistant's car confirmation. She turned when she heard him behind her. "Mr. Reed," she said. He stopped. "I'll be better," she said, not as a performance of accountability, not as something said to manage the relationship going forward, as a commitment she was making in front of a witness, to herself. "I expect so," Malik said. He meant that too, not as encouragement but as a genuine expectation, offered to someone who had demonstrated that they could meet it. He walked through the private terminal to the car that was waiting. The driver confirmed the hotel address and the morning meeting location without being asked, which meant his operations team had briefed him properly, which was the kind of small confirmation that systems working correctly always provide. He called Zoe. She answered on the second ring. The homework was finished then. She had a rule about calls during homework and had not broken it in 2 years of enforcing it on herself. She launched directly into a full account of a dispute in her science class that had involved experimental methodology and the correct interpretation of anomalous data. She had been right about the methodology. She had communicated her correctness in the specific way she had been working on communicating, making the right answer available to the room without making the person who had the wrong answer feel worse than the situation required. He listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions, each of which caused her to re-examine something she had moved past and give a fuller account. "How was your flight?" she asked. "Interesting," he said. "Good interesting or complicated interesting?" "Both," he said. She accepted this with the ease of a person who understands the categories and trusts that both has been accurately applied. "Did you eat lunch?" "On the aircraft." "What did you eat?" "A sandwich." "What kind?" He told her what kind. She found this acceptable. She told him about a marine biology documentary she had been watching, a cephalopod species whose color-shifting behavior she had found sufficiently interesting to read 3 additional research articles about, which she had read with the same organized attention she brought to the paper calendar. He listened to everything. She asked, at the end, about the maintenance agreement, and whether the change of control provision had been resolved to his satisfaction, because she had overheard him describing the provision on the phone 3 days ago, and had been thinking about the liability question since. He answered her question fully, because she had asked it fully, and a full question deserves a full answer. "Don't forget to eat dinner," she said, "before the morning meeting, not after." "I won't. You forgot in February," she said. "I remember forgetting in February." "Okay," she said. She was satisfied. They talked for 11 more minutes. He drove to the hotel, watching the Chicago skyline settle into the early evening, the lake visible at the end of certain streets, the city doing what cities do at this hour, shifting from one version of itself into another. He ate dinner. He reviewed his notes from the flight. He slept with the window cracked and woke at 5:30 to the ambient sound of a city in the early stages of its day. The morning meeting ran 4.5 hours and resolved every question he had brought to it. The change of control provision was revised twice, first to language that was closer but still insufficient, then to language that was right. Section 4's liability cap was adjusted to a figure he could defend. He read the final agreement 1 complete time before signing it, as he had always done, as he would always do, because reading what you sign is the minimum standard of seriousness about what you've agreed to. He was back in Maryland by Thursday evening. Zoe was at the kitchen table with homework, arranged in the careful formation of work that has been completed for at least an hour, but which has been kept in the positioned appearance of work in progress. He did not mention this. He set his bag in the hall and came into the kitchen, and she stood and hugged him fully, the way she always did when he came home from a trip, without self-consciousness, for exactly as long as it needed to last. He held on. She pulled back and looked at his face with the evaluating precision that was entirely her own. Good interesting, she said. Good interesting, he confirmed. They made dinner together. She had opinions about the proportions and was right about them. And they ate at the kitchen table. And she told him about the next installment of the marine biology documentary and the science fair project she had been developing since Tuesday, and an observation she had made about the way certain problems organize themselves when you approach them from the wrong direction, and reorganize entirely when you approach them from the right one. He listened to all of it. He was, in the uncomplicated way of a man who has gotten the things that matter most right, exactly where he needed to be. The Hale Meridian contract was signed 31 days later, at Reed Horizon's offices in Maryland, in the conference room that looked out over the flight line where 2 Gulf Streams and a regional turboprop were visible through the glass. Victoria Hale attended the signing personally. Her requirements document had been thorough. His director of business development told Malik she had drafted significant portions of it herself, rather than delegating the whole of it, which was the behavior of someone who had decided that this partnership mattered and had shown up to it accordingly. Across the signing table, she was composed and direct, the specific composure of someone who has come through something and decided that what comes after is a fresh start rather than an extended aftermath. Reed Horizon is going to take care of your team, Malik said. I have no doubt, Victoria said. She shook his hand across the table. She meant it. He could see that she meant it, and he met it with the straightforward confidence of someone who has been doing exactly what they said they were going to do for 8 years, and has no reason to expect that to change. There is a certain kind of person who moves through the world having decided, somewhere back in the accumulation of their experience, that the space they occupy belongs to them, that the people around them are features of that space, arranged for their convenience, accessible at a glance and dispensable accordingly. This is not an unusual stance. It is in many rooms a successful one. It produces results of a kind: compliance, deference, the illusion of control over an environment that is never actually controlled. What it does not produce ever is genuine knowledge of the room, of the people in it, of the specific quality of what might be built if the first 10 seconds were spent listening rather than concluding. Victoria Hale was capable of more than her first 10 seconds. She had demonstrated that at 35,000 feet in a moment that cost her something. The cost was real. The demonstration was real. That is what changed. Malik Reed had been carrying himself through first 10 seconds his entire adult life. The assessment, the categorization, the placement in a hierarchy that had nothing to do with who he was, and everything to do with what other people had decided to see when they saw him. He had not let those 10 seconds become his story. He had continued reading. He had continued building. He had continued, every Thursday evening when the flights allowed it, coming home to the kitchen table and making dinner with the person who kept a color-coded paper calendar because she had identified a gap in the information system and built a better one. That is what endures. Not the assessments made in 10 seconds. What the man builds when he sits back down and turns to Section 5. What the 9-year-old will carry with her when she is old enough to tell the story herself.